Today I'm going to start talking about how to migrate a Drupal 6 site to Gatsby JS. So we're doing this mainly because they're shutting our servers down, but we are not going to use Drupal 6 migrations for a few reasons. First of all, they're extremely brittle. It's an old framework, it's an old database, and if something goes wrong in the migration, it's going to be hard to get stuff back, and we don't want to lose any content or anything. Um, Second, migrating is just a pain. Even if we did do it the Drupal way, it would take quite a bit longer, and I don't see a good reason for doing that. We're moving it to Gatsby JS because Gatsby's fast, it's secure, there's no database to mess with. We're going and taking this database driven website and we're going to move it to a static site, which will make it way faster. It'll ensure our content is stored on GitHub, so we have version control. It'll make it really easy to maintain if work continues on it. And we have continuous integration and continuous deployment. So if we make changes, they'll be pushed to the live site right away, which will be really nice. So my process for doing this is a few things. So to start, I'm just going to web scrape the old website. So to do this, I use our web scrape GitHub repo, and it's stored on BSCS is GitHub account. So I'm not going to go into great detail on how that works right now. I might do another video on that. The basics are you give it a link to start on. So for this one, I'm doing the diabetes site. So I'm going to be web scraping supplements.bscs.org/supplement/deck12. So I'm going to give it the home page basically, and what it's going to do, our web scraper is going to get a list of anchor tags from this page and get the href of all those links, and then it'll go to each one and get any new links on those pages. So basically it's going to start out with one link and just keep growing with all these links until it gets every single link in the entire site. With each of those links, it's going to store the content. So it's going to grab the DOM. And in this case, we're going to search only for the content. So we're going to give it the node of this little box here, and then it'll get all the child elements of it. Once it does that, it's going to save them in a file. So if we go back to our web scrape directory, we created a new directory within it called scraped diabetes. That's the project I'm working on. And then content files. So our web scrape script, which will run as an executable, is going to save them in this directory. So you'll see here's the output. It saves every page right now as an HTML file. And then we're also saving additional information about the page in a TXT file. So if I go into one of these, I'll go into 73, and we'll go into TXT. Oh, messed that up. So here we are storing the title of the page and then the URL on the original site. So if I go to node 73, you'll see the title here. Here's the URL, and Drupal 6 doesn't have clean URLs, so they call it node 73. It's just a naming convention they do. So if we go back here, you'll see page title, here's the URL. And then in the directory, they'll do that for every page. So we see like 479. This project, there's 270 nodes. And you can see that there's a Unix command to list how many files are in the directory so you can see how many pages will be on your new website. So the next step in the process is to set up Gatsby. So I'm not going to do that right now because that's not within the scope of this video, but we use the Gatsby starter, whatever it is. They have their CLI. I think you put Gatsby new whatever project and it'll spit out your bootstrapped file structure to start. So we see to start, it'll have a source folder, it'll have like Gatsby browser, Gatsby config, all of these. And then for this site specifically, if we go into source, we have components, we have, it won't start with data, it won't start with global, it'll have images, it'll have pages, and it won't have templates. Let's see. So pages will look like this. It'll have a 404, it'll have an index file. This one's a little bit weird because we actually want our index. We don't want to ever go just to the root of our server. We actually, the home page has this weird link. If I go back, there is no root. If I go to home, it has supplements deck 12. So we'll take care of that later by doing a redirect from the home page to this link. And that probably won't be the case on many other websites, but it is on this one. So to start, I created a data folder directory inside of source. And that's where we're going to store all our outputted pages from WebScrape, and then we'll create pages from those files. So for this one, I created an HTML directory and a TXT directory. I did it this way because the title was not within the content element for our WebScrape, so I had to do two different WebScrape searches. So I stored them in two different files so I could just dump in the content in one and not have to do weird file manipulation to make it work. So you'll see I went in, I dumped in every HTML file in this folder, every TXT one in here. And that's pretty much all you have to do with getting your content from the old site to the new site. Now we just have to make pages from each one. So to do that, we're going to be working in Gatsby Node. And there's a few weird things we're going to do here. So the first one is that Gatsby does not have a plugin for reading HTML files. They have one for Markdown files and one for JSON, but not one for HTML. So if you try to create pages from HTML files or read them, you're going to get weird Webpack errors because Webpack doesn't know what to do with them. So because of that, we are going to create a new Webpack config in our exports here. We're going to use Actions, which is a Gatsby Node API thing. You can read about it on Gatsby's docs. And this thing should be good just to throw in here. You have your rules. And then we're going to test for .html, that's the extension, and we're using regex here to see that. We're using this HTML loader. You can find different loaders by searching for Webpack file loaders. And that's basically all we do for that. Once we have that, Gatsby can recognize HTML files and work with them. So the next thing we're going to do within this file is actually create pages based on the files. So to do that, we have to require path. It's a thing with create pages. I'm not completely sure what it does, but it's a syntactical thing that Gatsby needs in order for the create pages API to work. We're also going to require FS, and FS is a node library for reading files, and we'll get to why we're using that in a little bit. So then we add create pages to exports, and we need GraphQL and actions as parameters. And then we need also the create page API, and we set that equal to actions. Again, that's an API thing. We also are going to use create redirect and set that equal to actions. And we are going to use create redirect in this case to redirect any requests for our homepage or for our base path and send it to the supplement / deck 12 path, because that's really where our homepage is. So this one's really simple. We set it right here. We set our from path. So anything from our base, and it's a permanent redirect. So we want it to always redirect. Redirect in browser, we're going to set this to true because we are not changing our actual base ref on the backside. We're going to just redirect people in the browser if they request it. And then we set our to path of where we want them to redirect. And this is actually our home URL here, and it's relative, so we don't include the domain name. We just include the things after it, whatever you want to call those. So now we're going to get into actually creating pages, and in our case, we're going to use a couple different promises because we need JavaScript to interpret these synchronously, or else it's going to screw with our content and not give it the right thing. So the first thing is we're going to set this variable to grab our content template, and that path lives over here. We have a template for these pages, and I'm calling it content template.js. So now for our first query, here's the name of the query. I'm calling it HTML file query. It is an all file. That's the type of query. And you can see this if you go to the GraphQL link in Gatsby when you're developing. So if you're normally for Gatsby, we'd be creating pages based on markdown files. So that'd be all markdown remark. Here, we're doing all file. And it's also important that we first have to set our file directory, and that's done in Gatsby config. We use this Gatsby source file system plugin, and then we set it. Oh, nope, sorry, that's incorrect. We use Gatsby source file system. Oh yeah, so I have two here. That shouldn't be. But we're setting our path to data, which is where all our files are stored. So that way Gatsby knows where to look in your file system. So here, because of that, we can query all file, and then we're going to filter that query. We only want files that end in HTML, and we want them in the relative directory of HTML, which would be this directory here. Then we're going to do the standard edges and node. We're going to pass in, we want the node ID, the absolute path, and the name. The name will be, if this is 11.html, the name's 11. It's just the file name. The absolute path will be the actual path on your computer to the file. So that's our query. Once that resolves, so once we get the data back, Then if there's any errors, we're gonna reject and spit out an error message, and everything will stop, which would not be good. Then we're going to loop through each node, which each node in this case is a file. We're going to call our slug the name. And here's the tricky bit here where we're doing things pretty janky. We're going to create a new promise called get contents, and we're going to use this fs library that we required up here. And what that does is it's going to actually read the HTML file. So go in, read the data. So we give it the file we want to read. In this case, we're going to give it the absolute path so it knows where to look. UTF-8, that's some encoding stuff. And then we give parameters to this function we're creating. Error, I'm not using it here. You would set what you want to happen if there's an error when it's reading it. And then contents, which is what's inside the file that this is reading. And then with that, we're going to push our contents on this data array up here. So then down here, get contents, that's actually calling this variable, which is a promise, which is a function. So we're doing a function call down here. Once that resolves, after we push the contents, we're going to do yet another promise. We're going to replace the absolute path based on this regex expression that's HTML. So anywhere in the absolute path, which would be this file or this folder name, and the extension we're going to replace with txt. So now it's going to look for the same thing in this directory and with these extensions. Same thing, we're going to give the path here to read all the same. And then we're going to split our contents based on a comma. And if you remember, in our txt file, we have the title, then we have a comma, and then we have the old URL. And then we're going to push that array, which will be an array of 2 elements, into our data. So now our data array will contain the raw HTML from the old website, and then its second element of this array will be an array of 2 other things that will contain the page title and also the old URL. So normally if we were doing this, we would most likely get the page title from a clean URL, but because we're doing Drupal 6, they're going to just have these weird node URLs, so it's not very helpful in what the actual page is called. So once we do that, we're going to resolve, and this is important to have the first then return a promise, because then it allows the second then to run synchronously and wait for the first then. If you don't return a new promise, if you just returned a variable or something else, it's going to run both these then synchronously. So then our second then, we're going to actually create a page using the create page API. We're going to give it the path, which is where we want the new page to live, what its URL will be on the site. So we're going to give it this hard-coded thing of we want it to live at supplements deck 12 node, and then the slug. And if you remember, a slug is the name, so like 469. So it's going to create a new page with 469 in here. The component, we're going to pass in our template. So it's going to pass in the data for the page into that template as props actually. And then context. Actually, that's not true. It's gonna create a page based off the template, but then context is where you're gonna pass data into the new page props, because the content template, which we'll get to in a second, is actually, I don't even know what you would call it. It's a React component, sorry. So we're gonna pass data, which is goofy. So we're gonna pass this array of data into context. And the reason we're doing this is because we're reading these files. This is something that has to be done server side, so we're doing it in Node. Normally, how Gatsby would recommend us to do this is to query for any data we need within the template itself. But because we're doing it server side, we can't do this. So we're basically hacking Gatsby to do what we want. And then we're going to pass the slug as well, which will be important for the query in the template. And then down here, we're going to return promise to all, and then a list of promises we want to resolve. So in this case, the only promise we have is this one. This page is one. But if we also on the site wanted to make any pages with a different template or different data, different path, whatever, we would create a new promise, do all the same thing, and then add that promise to this list. And it's actually pretty useful. Okay, I'm going to close the data directory and go to templates. Okay, here we are with our content template. I think pretty much all our imports are pretty intuitive. React component has to be in every Gatsby page. GraphQL, we're going to use that at the bottom to query some data that's specific to each page. Style components, we're going to use that to do some custom CSS on some stuff. Layout, so we want every page to be wrapped in our layout element or a component, and that way we're going to have, let's see, we're going to have like the title, the nav bar, all this around on every page, and then we're just throwing our content in this middle section. Okay, and then I had a bunch of CSS styles that no longer apply, so they're commented out. So content template, we're going to do it in our standard way we do React component syntax. Let's see. On component did mount, this is no longer what we want to do here. So this is old, so ignore anything. And on component did mount, we're going to go straight down to render, which is a React lifecycle hook. It's going to return this template for us. So we're going to wrap this in react.fragment, which is just longhand for this. But we're going to do that because bit.io does not recognize the shorthand syntax. So whenever we use Gatsby, we have to use react.fragment just out of habit now. So we're going to set this SEO component, and that's a Gatsby thing that just helps with search rankings, basically. So we're going to give it a title, and we're going to do this.props.pagecontext.data index 1, index 0. So our page context is this context here in our Gatsby node. So then we have page context.data, So that's this data variable. We could also do .slug. But then data, if we remember, is an array that contains the contents in its 0 index, and then it contains an array of 2 elements in its first index. So we want to name it, we want our first element in the data, which will be the array of our additional site data. And then the 0 index of that will be the page title. So we're just going to set that as the title. I'm not super worried about SEO. There's probably a lot more we could do with it, but this is a site we don't really care a whole lot about with that. I'm just giving it some generic keywords to plug in. Again, it'd be better to make those more specific for a given page for SEO rankings. Then we wrap in our layout component, we wrap in container, which is a React Bootstrap component. We're gonna have a title wrapper, and what that is gonna be this yellow bar here that contains the title. We're gonna give it an ID equal to the slug plus an ID. And the reason we did that was because for this site, you'll see this one's yellow. If I go to a different node, it'll be red, and that's based on this ID here in our styles. So that's how we got that to be different for every page. Again, title, we're going to pass in the page title. That'll show up on our title wrapper. Here, we're setting our breadcrumbs. So you'll see here's the breadcrumb. It'll be a link to home and then an arrow and then a link to whatever page we're on. And if you click home, it'll take you home. So here we want breadcrumb on every page that's home. And then same thing, it'll be the page title. But we only want that, or we don't want that if it's the home page. So if our slug equals deck12, we're going to ignore it. So then we're going to jack this middle container ID, this wrapper ID, float wrap, call main. Those are all elements in our old site, and they're important because they contain CSS that's linked to them that we stole from the old website, and it'll just help the layout to look right. So then here we're going to use dangerously set inner HTML, and the reason it's dangerous is because if you have a site where someone can set their own HTML, they can set a JavaScript script in there and run JavaScript on your page potentially. I'm not worried about this because we're pre-compiling all our pages at build time, and then when our site's actually deployed, it's just static. So there's not a cross-site scripting risk there. Here's the syntax. You do these double underscores HTML, and then we're going to set this to our page context data and the 0th element, which is our page content, which would look like this. It's just an HTML file. Nothing fancy, nothing React. It's just what we web scraped, excuse me. And then down at the bottom, we are using a GraphQL query. And honestly, I don't think I'm actually using this. So this potentially could go away. If you had, normally the Gatsby way is you query your information here that you need instead of passing random data in through a Gatsby node. So couple last things I did. You can see I'm using React Bootstrap. So in components, I did this for our nav bar. So I took React Bootstrap, got the nav bar components, and then basically I created a static nav bar because in the site, all these links are static. So I just created nav bar, added all these links. You can see that here, it's a mess. Absolutely one of the ugliest things I've ever seen, but that's okay. So